Continued from Chapter 4 Notes. King James Version. Cain's Family Chapter 4 verses 17 to 24. Verses 17 to 19. We do not know who Cain's wife was. Adam and Eve may have had other children. It is not clear whether Cain built a city. It is possible that his son Enoch built it. The word for city might in fact mean a very small place. Verses 20 to 22. Cain's descendants had great skills, but they opposed God, and Lamech himself was a very evil man. Verse 23. Lamech was proud about his sin. He had killed a young man, perhaps even a boy, because the boy had hurt him. In the New Testament, Jesus told Peter how many times he should forgive people. It was a very large number. Single quote 70 times 7 single quote. Maybe Jesus was thinking about Lamech then. Adam's family from Adam to Noah chapter 4 verse 25 and chapter 5 verse 32. Verse 25. Seth means that someone had given something. God had given Seth to Eve. In other words, Seth was born. God had not forgotten his promise. God had promised that someone from among Adam's descendants would save the earth's people. Genesis chapter 3 verse 15. Verse 26. People began to call the Lord's name. People began to think about God. That may mean that they prayed to him. It may mean that they talked about him. And they talked also about everything that he did. It may mean that they possibly called themselves the Lord's people. This chapter is very important. Its writer tells us about people that really lived. That is why it is important. He tells us what some people were like at that time. These events really happened. Reading of Genesis chapter 5 King James Version. Sponsored by Lunsford's Daily Sunday School. Produced by W. Matthew Harris Senior Productions. Genesis chapter 5. Verse 1. This is the account about Adam and his family. On the day when God created Adam, he made Adam like God. Verse 2. God created man and woman. God blessed them. He called them Adam on the day when he created them. Verse 3. When Adam had lived for 130 years, he became the father of a son. The son was like Adam himself. The son was like Adam's own image. Adam called his son Seth. Verse 4. After Seth was born, Adam lived for 800 more years. Adam had other sons and daughters. Verse 5. His whole life lasted 930 years, and then he died. Verse 6. When Seth had lived for 105 years, he became Enosh's father. Verse 7. After Enosh was born, Seth lived for 807 more years. Seth had other sons and daughters. Verse 8. His whole life lasted 912 years. Then he died. Verse 9. When Enosh had lived for 90 years, he became Kenan's father. Verse 10. After Kenan was born, Enosh lived for 815 more years. Enosh had other sons and daughters. Verse 11. His whole life lasted 905 years. Then he died. Verse 12. When Kenan had lived for 70 years, he became Mahalalel's father. Verse 13. After Mahalalel was born, Kenan lived for 840 more years. Kenan had other sons and daughters. Verse 14. His whole life lasted 910 years. Then he died. Verse 15. When Mahalalel had lived for 65 years, he became Jared's father. Verse 16. After Jared was born, Mahalalel lived for 830 more years. Mahalalel had other sons and daughters. Verse 17. His whole life lasted 895 years. Then he died. Verse 18. When Jared had lived for 162 years, he became Enoch's father. Verse 19. After Enoch was born, Jared lived for 800 more years. Jared had other sons and daughters. Verse 20. His whole life lasted 962 years, and then he died. Verse 21. When Enoch had lived for 65 years, he became Methuselah's father. Verse 22. After Methuselah was born, Enoch lived for 300 more years. Enoch was walking with God. He had other sons and daughters. Verse 23. His whole life lasted 365 years. Verse 24. Then Enoch walked with God and Enoch disappeared. God took him away. Verse 25. When Methuselah had lived for 187 years, he became Lamech's father. Verse 26. After Lamech was born, Methuselah lived for 782 more years. Methuselah had other sons and daughters. Verse 27. His whole life lasted for 969 years, and then he died. Verse 28. When Lamech had lived for 182 years, he became the father of a son. Verse 29. Lamech called his son Noah. He said, "We pray that the sun will bring rest to us from this hard work. It is hard work to farm the ground because God has cursed the ground." Verse 30. After Noah was born, Lamech lived for 595 more years. Lamech had other sons and daughters. Verse 31. His whole life lasted for 777 years, and then he died. Verse 32. After Noah was 500 years old, he became the father of Shem, Ham and Japheth. This chapter contrasts with Genesis chapter 4 verses 17-24. Chapter 4 contains a list of Cain's descendants. Cain's descendants had many skills, but they were very wicked. They became a very large family, but they all died in the flood. But chapter 5 gives us a list of Adam's descendants by Seth. Among this large family were several people who really served God. Especially, Enoch's life interests us, verses 21-24. Enoch walked with God. This means that Enoch had a special relationship or friendship with God. In fact, his friendship was so special that God did not allow Enoch to die. Compare Elijah in 2 Kings chapter 2 verses 11-12. Notes on the verses. Verse 1. The words in this verse show that it starts a new section in Genesis. Look at Genesis chapter 2 verse 4, chapter 6 verse 9, chapter 10 verse 1. It starts the account about Adam's descendants that came from his son Seth. This is the account about Adam and his family. The Hebrew text here actually means the book about Adam's family. Verses 3-32. It is possible that there are gaps in this account. A man in the list may have been the next person's grandfather or ancestor. He may not have been the actual father. However, it is likely that there are no gaps. That is because the writer gives exact ages. The earth might be a lot older than Genesis seems to show. Many people have that belief. However, scientists are not at all certain how old the earth is. It does not matter if days and years were a different length then. We know that God made the earth. And He made everything in it. If time was different then, it does not make God less wonderful. And it does not make man less wicked. We trust God. At that time, people lived longer. Life was healthier. There were not so many illnesses. Enoch, verse 18, and Lamech, verse 25, were also names of Cain's descendants. In verse 22, Enoch walked with God. The writer uses the same word here as when God was walking in Eden. You can read more about Enoch in Jude chapter 14 and 15. In verse 25, we read about Methuselah. We do not know what that name meant. Someone has said that it meant this: when he dies, it will happen. It here means the flood. If so, Methuselah lived a long time because God gave extra time to wicked men. God gave them extra time so that they could change their behavior. Also, the name may mean just single quotations. That reminds us that we'll die, even if we may live for a very long time. In verse 29, Noah sounds like rest in Hebrew. In verse 32, Noah's sons were in fact born at different times.